Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Good evening. My name is Jeff Mullen. This is the 20th session of the public hearing for comprehensive permit for 582 Blue Hill Avenue. My name is Jeffrey Mullen. I'm the acting chair of this panel for the Board of Appeals. With me is Giselle Joffer and Frank O'Brien, members of the board. Tonight, the principal agenda item is to hear from Mr. Hill and his team and members of the neighbors on their reaction to the application as submitted by the Tamposi organization, Mr. Schumer and his team. Before we get to that, it's a couple of pieces of homework. I did get a letter from Mr. Hill, through Mr. Hill, from Mr. Chessier, responding to the stormwater design. I've also received communication from Mr. Reardon. That Mr. Reardon has reviewed Mr. Chessier's report and is available tonight. He's here with us for comment. So I want to make people aware of that, and I will ask Mr. Reardon for a response to that at the appropriate time. But being mindful of our commitment to Mr. Hill's organization, the Vos Hill Neighborhood Association, we're going to reserve the principal amount of the time of this hearing for that. There was some homework from the last hearing that we have not heard back from, so I'm just going to remind the applicant that there are still some outstanding matters. I think there was a conversation about sidewalk plans. You were going to put together a list of conditions that would be acceptable to the applicant as we close down the hearing. There was a discussion of a dog or an animal, a walk there. Those are, I mean, I've got some other homework pieces for myself. I think we still need to run down the trash plan. Although there was a plan, I think perhaps submitted at the last hearing. Let me also say that we still have not heard from the town's engineer with respect to the stormwater design in particular, although I wouldn't want to limit his testimony to that. But I know that Mr. Zawinski has committed to finding a good time for him to come. So we want to make time, and perhaps the next hearing, ideally, it would be good to hear from him. I've also committed to hearing from the planning board. They have reached out to the Board of Appeals and asked to testify. They're going to be submitting a letter. The planning board's elected body in the town of Milton, in deference to the planning board. We want to hear from them, so we're going to take some time to hear from them. And then lastly, Mr. Schumer, we need to hear from you on the conditions, not the conditions, I'm sorry, the waivers. So that's all a long way of saying we're running out of time up against the schedule that's been agreed to. So at some point, maybe not tonight, but perhaps the next hearing, which will be next Wednesday, I'm going to want to reserve some time to calendar the remaining period, the remaining hearings, so that we can get everybody in. But I want to give people, particularly the people that I just named, a indication of what's at least on my mind as we try to deal with the remaining issues. So, Mr. Schomer, is there an objection to that approach?
Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the board. No objection from us. If I may, just a couple of words on updating the board with respect to our homework assignments, Mr. Chair. Sure. We have a list of to-do items that we're working through, and we have it in our calendar to have what we expect to be the final set of plans with additional details that were requested by the town's peer reviewers and a number of the town department heads at last week's hearing, specifically regarding the bicycle parking details, the trash management plan details, a detail sheet for the pedestrian flow around the site as Mr. Serwinski had requested, with lighting, and some details about signage, crosswalks, and things of that nature, as well as additional details of tree protection, which was requested by Mr. Bomer, additional detail of the play area, which is, as I believe we mentioned at the last hearing, Mr. Chair, is to be slightly expanded per Mr. Bomer's recommendations. and I believe also details on the proposed signage for the project. So those are all within our plans to submit within the next week. And included in that will be a list of proposed conditions from us.
Okay. That sounds good. In light of the fact that there'll be additional testimony coming in and the fact that we've asked Vos Hill Neighborhood Association to testify tonight, I'm prepared to give the Vos Hill Neighborhood Association an opportunity to speak to the additional materials. I think that's fair. So, I don't want Mr. Hill to have to ask for that. It would be granted that, assuming that there will be something to say. So you all have a completed opportunity. So you'll have two chances. Although I will note that, we won't reserve an entire night for that, but we'll give you a chance, and we'll certainly give the applicant an opportunity to comment on anything that they've heard from the neighbors or from the town officials subsequent to the completion of, putting in your completed application. Fair enough?
Fair enough. Just to be clear, the changes that we're making at this point are really, I would say, very, very fine details and adding to the plans rather than changing them. So we, of course, welcome further feedback from Attorney Hill and his clients and the rest of the neighbors. But the point is more about refining the details.
No, I understand that. I'm a believer that the positions you take and where you stand is often a function of where you sit. So we'll still give the neighbors an opportunity to comment, despite the fact that you may think that they're minor issues. We'll leave that to the neighbors as to whether or not they are or they aren't, for the purposes of just completing this hearing. Is that acceptable to everybody?
That is acceptable. One question at the moment, if I may, Mr. Chair. I believe from the last week's hearing, Mr. Reardon and Mr. Bomer were expecting to be submitting some final letters of peer review. I'm not aware that those were filed, and I certainly haven't received them, but I was just wondering if those are expected within the next week or so.
I am expecting them. I don't know when to expect them. It looks like Mr. Reardon may be taking himself off of mute. Mr. Reardon?
At least a week.
Okay. I asked only not to try to pressure the peer reviewers. I know that they're snowed under with work at the moment, as are we all, I'm sure. But more just to for our planning purposes, in case there were any additional comments that weren't already discussed. I think for Mr. Reardon in particular, the technical aspects of the drainage from his testimony last week, I think most of the issues are resolved at this point, to the extent possible. But we look forward to the further letters from him and Mr. Bomer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schomer, Mr. Reardon. Ms. Barrett, perhaps you could follow up with Mr. Bomer on the finalization of his letter, although he did have a detailed letter and he did it quite nicely so that we can follow along. So I appreciate that.
Sure.
Mr. Hill.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Any questions from the board before we begin? Comments?
Not for me, thank you.
None from me, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Hill.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And tonight we have with us Scott Horsley, our hydrologist, John Chesia, our civil engineer, and David Black, our consulting traffic engineer. I'm going to start with my closing argument, so to speak. The three of them are available to elaborate on any of the technical issues and to, of course, answer any questions the board members have. But my presentation will cover all aspects of the project, including the design, traffic safety, hydrology, stormwater, emergency access, and probably a couple other things I'm forgetting. So I'm going to just move my camera and launch right into it. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, the first issue I wanted to raise was the project's size, scale, and massing, and that's, in our view, contrary to the Chapter 40B design principles. You heard testimony from the Planning Board and the Historic Commission, among others, that this design is actually inconsistent with the DHCD handbook approach to Chapter 40B design reviews that suggests that projects can be deliberately designed to minimize disruption with neighborhood patterns. The planning board commented on the original application and design that the overall building design presents a very urban character that does not relate to its context. With the modest reduction from 188 units to 86 units, the project still evokes urbanism in a suburban context. The proposed buildings, labeled North Building and West Building on the site, contain 4 stories of living space. Your peer review consultant, Mr. Bomer, appropriately criticized the massing and intensity of use of the site on June 7th, 2021, suggesting trimming back both ends of the North Building. He specifically recommended that the North Building should be set back in plane or slightly closer to Blue Hill Avenue than the preserved historic facade is. This would open up the view corridor of the existing historic residence from the public realm. He also suggested that the eastern tail of the North Building be shortened. This is the section of building closest to Meeting House Lane and due to natural topography looms over the neighborhood. I would like to just share my screen to add a few slides if I may. So this is the massing of the current project. As you can see, the existing historic structure is overshadowed by the 4-story buildings. As Mr. O'Connell noted, actually the last meeting, the height of these proposed buildings is actually taller than the chimneys on the historic structure. Now, Mr. Bomer's suggestion was to cut the ends off of the North Building. The applicant responded to the first suggestion, but not the second. It determined that cutting the western end of the North Building would result in the displacement of 12 residential units. But instead of simply reducing the size of the building, it is proposed to relocate those units to the West Building, increasing the height of the West Building to 5 stories and adding a story to the eastern end of the North Building, giving it a 5-story exposure presence to the Meeting House Lane neighbors, directly contradicting Mr. Bomer's design comment. The applicant's proposed changes would do more harm than good, or in the vernacular, rob Peter to pay Paul. Now, neighbor Rob Levash, who is a member of the Vos Hill Group, he's a registered professional architect. He commented on June 7th that both buildings are completely out of scale when compared to the existing historic structure and overall neighborhood context, or the existing residential structures in the neighborhood. The only sensible solution is to scale back the size of the buildings, something that the applicant has refused to consider on grounds that any reduction in the unit density would be uneconomic. Curiously, the applicant previously argued that any reduction of unit density below 118 units was uneconomic, but it somehow managed to drop 32 units. Mr. Bomer acknowledged that the Milton Historic Commission's March 22nd recommendation to eliminate the top floor of the North Building, which would help address the fit of the project in the existing neighborhood. Now, the historic importance of the McGinley Estate, and in particular the gardens designed by Ellen Shipman, the quote, Dean of American Women Landscape Architects, and the threat that's posed by the project, compelled a rare conglomeration of alarming comment letters from every important historic architectural organization in Massachusetts, including Preservation Massachusetts, the Society of Architecture Historians, Historic New England, which runs the Eustis Estate here in Milton, the Cultural Landscape Foundation, and the Garden Conservancy. While acknowledging the gesture that was made by the applicant to preserve the historic residence and gardens in its latest plan iterations, Mr. Bomer commented on June 7th that, on June 7th, mind you, just a couple of weeks ago, that the current design, quote, buries the historic structure more than 70 feet back from the facades of the new structures, which when combined with the proposed height of the new buildings, seriously diminishes its prominence and places the entry court in shadow for most of the year. The chair of the Historic Commission echoed that comment and was particularly critical of the applicant's preservation intentions, observing on June 23rd that the house is virtually invisible except from straight in front of it. The bottom line here is that despite the verbiage of the applicant, the present plan evidences little by way of preservation in the true sense of the word. The building and gardens appear as afterthoughts in the plan, retained in such fashion simply so that they can say they, quote, preserved them. The applicant proposed to pull back the north building farther away from Blue Hill Avenue, which partially addresses this concern, but it traded an improvement for a cost by increasing the height of the west building to 5 stories. Despite the modest improvements made over the last 6 months, the applicant has failed to strike an appropriate balance between addressing the legitimate historic preservation and design concerns raised almost uniformly by Milton officials and boards and addressing the shortage of affordable housing. The applicant's resistance to reducing the intensity of use of the project site will prevent this project from achieving that balance and should be rejected. The applicant should be put to the test of defending its likely unsustainable burden of proving that further reducing the density of the project will render the project uneconomic pursuant to the Chapter 40B regulations. The state's 40B program expresses a preference for projects that conform to the Commonwealth's Sustainable Development Principles, which were originally adopted by the Romney administration in 2007. To that end, the subsidizing agency, Mass Housing, requires all 40B applications to complete a self-assessment on its Sustainable Development Scorecard. This project is unequivocally the antithesis of smart growth or sustainable development. And the project site is barely supported by mass transit, being too remote from the closest commuter rail station for that to be considered walkable. The MBTA Route 716 bus runs along Route 138 between Mattapan Square and Cobb's Corner, but this service only provides 4 inbound and 4 outbound trips in the entire morning, and the same for the afternoon. This limited transit service cannot support commuting by rail without involving an auto trip, and has inadequate frequency to make commuting by bus a viable need. The limitations noted in the MBTA schedule for the Route 716 bus, that pedestrian accessibility underlines the fact that pedestrian accessibility in the vicinity of the site is extremely poor, and there are no sidewalks connecting the site to the local neighborhood or beyond. The bus has to be flagged down for somebody to capture the bus on their commute into Boston in the morning. Bicycle access along Route 138 is provided by wide shoulders in each direction. However, the cycling environment is adversely impacted by the absence of buffered bike lanes, separating the high traffic speeds along the roadway. The board's peer review consultant, Cliff Bomer, observed on February 13th that the site is not well served by public transportation, and given the lack of nearby amenities and pedestrian accommodations, it is fair to say that the future residents would be fully dependent on cars and to a lesser degree on bicycles. Our consultant, David Black, echoed that sentiment, stating overall the lack of reasonable alternative transportation modes dictates that the proposed project would be highly auto-dependent and would not reflect sustainable transportation characteristics. Despite its dependence on automobile transportation, the applicant is providing only 133 parking spaces for 86 total apartment units for a ratio of 1.5 spaces per unit. The zoning bylaw requires 2 spaces per unit. The ITE Parking Generation Manual contains recommendations for various land use categories. For the mid-rise multifamily housing in a general urban suburban setting, not within a half a mile of rail transit, the corresponding ITE parking ratio is 1.7 spaces per dwelling unit or 1 space per bedroom, suggesting that the parking supply needed to support the project is approximately 147 or 145 spaces, respectively. A number of factors make expansion of parking supply on the site untenable, necessitating instead a reduction in the parking demand for the project, which is unrealistic in light of the site's previously noted auto dependence. Now, on January 25th, Mr. Black commented that the applicant's traffic report did not clearly demonstrate that the 2 proposed driveway intersections complied with the applicable site distance standards. Now, there are no state regulations governing minimum site distances at intersections, but there are widely accepted industry standards that are published in the so-called AASHTO manual. The Mass DOT has the Mass DOT Project Development and Design Guide has specifically stated that project designers should refer to the AASHTO manual for use in calculation of site distances. The AASHTO standards have been accepted by the State Housing Appeals Committee and 40B appeals. So there's no disagreement here that AASHTO applies to the project. Mr. Michaud, the traffic engineer for the applicant, has represented that the project complies with AASHTO site distance standards. In response to Mr. Black's memorandum, Mr. Michaud presented illustrations containing horizontal and vertical profiles intended to prove that minimum site distances have been met. However, the profiles lack important details that are necessary to establish compliance. Specifically, the critical intersection site distance criteria. It is acknowledged that AASHTO requires available site distances to be measured at the decision point of the vehicle exiting the secondary road, or in this case, the driveway, which AASHTO provides is 14.5 feet back from the travel lane of the intersecting road here, Blue Hill Avenue. Further, a clear sight line must not be encumbered by obstructions that cannot be removed by the applicant, and therefore the sight line must remain within the boundaries of the project site and the public right-of-way. It cannot cross over private property like the Delphic Academy without a view easement. Mr. Michaud's sightline profiles, as you can see on my screen, that were provided with his March 21st letter, do not delineate the edge of the Blue Hill Avenue travel lanes, and do not delineate the property boundaries, and do not appear to measure the site distances from in front of the stop bar at the driveway's intersection, as you can see on the screen. Instead, I'm sorry, it is measuring it in front of the stop bar instead of behind the stop bar where it should be measured. This anomaly appears in the profiles for both the northerly and southerly driveway intersections. Further, Mr. Michaud's site distance analysis does not account for the installation of a shared use path on the west side of Blue Hill Avenue. That feature will likely require the stop bar to be moved further west into the site and therefore require a reassessment of available site distances in both directions. In a similar 40B project in the town of Weston, Mr. Michaud, wearing a different hat as the Weston Zoning Board's peer review engineer, commented that the developer's proposed driveway layout should also be updated to depict proposed driveway orientation relative to corridor improvements to ensure proposed location orientation is consistent with the planned improvements. In Weston, very similar to Milton, a shared use path is proposed as part of a future road reconstruction project. So we would say that what is good for Weston is good for Milton, and that Mr. Michaud should have followed his own advice by testing whether site distances would be satisfied here on this project under future conditions with a shared use path. I'd like to move to fire protection and emergency access. On my screen now is the May 5th, 2021 auto turn exhibit that was filed by the applicant, and it's a computer-generated turning simulation model called auto turn that is intended to comply with the quote swept path analysis requirement of the state fire prevention code. That's section 18.1.1.3. And the purpose of this is to show that the roadways and driveways are sufficiently wide to enable the Milton fire apparatus to maneuver around the project site. However, the auto turn exhibit reveals that as the simulated ladder truck maneuvers the two rear corners, there is no margin for error. The truck barely squeezes past these corners, which are confined by walls. The entire driveway is relied upon as a fire lane, 20 feet wide. That's the minimum under state regs, which if obstructed for any reason and to any degree, the fire truck will not be able to pass if the fire lane is less than the width of the swept path analysis. We also question whether these corners satisfy the state fire prevention code's minimum required inside turning radius standard of 25 feet. As you can see with the red lines, that one in the middle is the inside radius, And that does not appear to be 25 feet. In fact, it appears to be less than 20 feet. Emergency access within the parking garage is still non-conforming to the fire prevention code. Under the code, dead-end fire access roads cannot exceed 150 feet without an approved turnaround area such as a cul-de-sac. Parking lot lanes are considered to be fire lanes under the fire prevention code. And this long lane within the garage is approximately 400 feet from the entrance to the far end of the west building. There's no turnaround, as you can see, at the end of the garage. The auto turn exhibit did not even analyze the turning maneuver to get into the garage or the inside turning radius. In any event, or in the event of a car fire or a fire in the mechanical room or trash room, emergency vehicles will not be able to respond within the garage. According to the applicant's own data, the project site is constrained by relatively shallow groundwater elevations. The site is adjacent to jurisdictional wetland system that is comprised of bordering vegetated wetlands and an off-site open channel stream. The revised project design will generate a significant level of stormwater runoff over existing conditions due to substantially greater lot coverage. The applicant proposes a stormwater system that includes a series of infiltration basins, a discharge to a detention basin with an offlow or overflow to the off-site stream, and discharge of stormwater into the municipal street drainage system in Meeting House Lane, which discharges to Pine Tree Brook and the Neponset River. These data indicate that the proposed infiltration systems are designed to cumulatively recharge 280% more water over the site compared to existing conditions. According to our expert hydrologist, Scott Horsley, this increase in recharge will cause rises in the groundwater levels throughout the site and on adjacent properties. It will also increase base flow to the adjacent wetland stream, constituting an alteration to the wetlands. Further, construction of the western building and the subsurface parking garage will require excavation 13 to 15 feet below grade, which is problematic given that the applicant's own test pit data indicates shallow groundwater at approximately 2 feet below the surface. Thus, as illustrated by the graphic on the screen, the floor of the parking garage will be approximately 12 feet below the seasonal high groundwater elevation. The applicant has not explained how it will construct the garage without it flooding, or how it will prevent groundwater seepage or hydrostatic pressure post-construction. The applicant has not provided the board with a structural engineering opinion or a hydrogeological model that would predict, based on the existing groundwater contours, flow direction, and soil conditions, where the displaced groundwater will end up. Your peer review consultant's speculation that groundwater will dam up gradient of the west building and therefore not impact the infiltration systems on the other side of the building is just that, speculation, and is not based upon scientific modeling. Our experts believe that groundwater levels will equilibrate and that this will not have a dam effect. A groundwater model such as ModFlow should be developed to verify these conditions. The hydrology modeling that the applicant did on the site was flawed and underestimates the potential interferences between the existing groundwater and the infiltrative functions of the project's stormwater system. In order to prevent flooding from occurring downstream, or in this case on Meeting House Lane and the open channel stream, the applicant proposes to store and infiltrate stormwater on the site through a network of pipes and subsurface basins. Applicants such as this one use computer software programs to simulate storm events and to design drainage systems to modulate runoff. But the program relies on the accuracy of many inputs made by the user of the program, including existing groundwater elevations and soil conditions. One of the most important inputs to the model is the saturated thickness of the ground beneath these systems. Saturated thickness is the depth from the water table to the bottom of the aquifer. Typically, the deeper the saturated thickness, the greater the storage capacity of the system and less mounding. The DEP Stormwater Handbook requires that groundwater mounding analyses be conducted whenever shallow groundwater conditions are present. The applicant has provided the results of their groundwater mounding analyses in the revised engineering report. However, the applicant has used a non-conservative input value for the saturated thickness, 20 feet, when it only has reliable soil data showing at most 6.1 feet below the ground surface. A groundwater mound under an infiltration system is normally higher when the saturated thickness is shallow, as there's less storage beneath the system. Where this applicant has used an unjustified and arbitrary saturated thickness value of 20 feet, its groundwater mounding analysis potentially underestimates the groundwater mounding impacts associated with the project by a factor of 4. This error would have cumulative impacts on the reliability of the entire stormwater model, since a higher groundwater mound would restrict infiltration to a greater degree than the model anticipated and was relying on to modulate runoff off-site. Where the water table is already high on the site, recharge volumes are predicted to double or triple under proposed conditions, and flooding is already experienced under existing conditions by downgradient neighbors. It was imperative for the applicant to prove the viability of the parking garage without adverse flooding impacts. Our request for a comprehensive hydrological assessment on May 26 has gone unanswered by the applicant. Now, finally, I want to discuss the current debate over the stormwater management system and its impacts on the off-site infrastructure. John Chesia, our engineer, filed the report yesterday, and he'll speak to that tonight. Stormwater design deficiencies have plagued this project from its inception. Originally, the applicant proposed a massive stormwater infiltration system underneath the parking garage. The applicant retreated from that plan in March, proposing a network of pipes and chambers that would hold and infiltrate some water and discharge the rest of it out of pipe that was only 20 feet uphill from the property at 56 Meeting House Lane. That plan violated several stormwater requirements, state stormwater requirements, including setbacks to walls and foundations. So by late May, the applicant had pivoted again, now proposing 2 discharge points, one in the direction of the open channel stream that runs south to the Alfred Road 42-inch pipe that ultimately discharges into Trout Brook, and the other a direct connection into a 12-inch drainage system in Meeting House Lane. The current drainage design, however, is materially flawed in 2 important respects. First, the design relies on hydrogeological assumptions, as previously discussed, that are speculative and unproven. And absent a comprehensive hydrogeological assessment, these assumptions are speculative and unproven. The west building foundation is in 12 feet of groundwater, and there's increase of recharge across the site by 280%. The applicant's plan to attenuate peak flows through on-site detention and infiltration to control for downhill flooding is simply unreliable. Like any predictive modeling exercise, this model is only as good as the assumptions and inputs. And as Mr. Horsley opined in his letter of May 25th, the applicant's groundwater mounding analysis is incomplete because it does not account for the combined groundwater rise from all 6 proposed infiltration systems and relies on that faulty assumption about the saturated thickness. Finally, Mr. Bomer aptly noted that consideration should be given to whether the groundwater displaced from the construction of that west building will interfere with the functioning of the infiltration systems. These systems rely on having at least 2 feet of separation from groundwater, and it is possible that the groundwater elevations will change across the site once that garage is installed. Second, the project's drainage system now relies heavily on off-site drainage systems that ultimately discharge into the brooks. This is problematic as the applicant civil engineer, Mr. Burke, has acknowledged that both the open channel stream and the Meeting House Lane Alfred Road systems are undersized and are surcharged under current conditions. Our engineer, John Chesia, has reviewed the offsite drainage infrastructure report that was prepared by Mr. Burke and found that by Mr. Burke's own calculations, there will be large increases in both peak rates and volumes of runoff leaving the project site and entering the Meeting House Lane drainage system as compared to existing conditions. His findings are summarized in a letter that we filed yesterday. Now, Mr. Burke suggests on page 7 of his report that peak rates of flow will decrease under post-development conditions. And Attorney Schomer had stated the same conclusion in his letter dated June 22nd. All of this is an attempt to demonstrate compliance with the state stormwater standard number 2 and to allay concerns that the project will potentially worsen the already untenable flooding conditions in the neighborhood. Now, Mr. Burke's summary table on page 7 suggests that for all these storm events that he modeled, the peak flow rates will be marginally lower than under existing conditions. Now, for example, as shown on my screen, for the 2-year storm event, Mr. Burke states that the rate rate of flow is 66.15 cubic feet per second under existing conditions and 65.81 CFS under proposed conditions. However, Mr. Burke did not disclose that these rates only apply only to water entering reach 9R, which is the very last segment of the drainage network that discharges into the 15-inch pipe that goes into Trout Brook. As you can see in this routing diagram, there are multiple reaches before you get to the outfall, the 15-inch outfall. And it starts with reach 5R. Reach 5R is the top of Meeting House Lane. That's where the project is proposed to connect to the system that's already in Meeting House Lane. Now, as shown on the watershed maps that were attached to Mr. Burke's report, the watershed area for reach 9R, which is shown as area X55, is smaller under post-development conditions than it is under current conditions, existing conditions. This is kind of hard to see on my screen, but a portion of the project site that was within the watershed under existing conditions is rerouted to the watershed for reach 5R under proposed conditions, the point of the project's connection to Meeting House Lane. And further, as shown in the watershed maps, the watershed for reach 9R includes significantly more land than just the project site. It includes the backyards of properties on Meeting House Lane, as well as properties on Barber Lane. Mr. Burke and Mr. Schomer's use of the rates for reach 9R are selective and ignores the fact that for all of the upper reaches in the network, reaches 5R, 6R, 7R, and 8R, the peak rate of inflow is either the same or greater under post-development conditions. Now, under the hydrology handbook for conservation commissioners that's published by DEP, it states that post-development peak rates for the 2- and 10-year storms must be controlled to be less than or equal to pre-development conditions. These peak rates are evaluated either at the point of discharge from the development or at the down gradient property line. Reach 9R is neither. It's a discharge point for a 12.9 acre watershed area that includes runoff from the project site as well as from adjacent properties. The appropriate geographic point to measure the pre and post development peak rates is reach 5R, the point of discharge for the project. No other land is included in the reach 5R watershed than the project site. As was illustrated in the table that's attached to Mr. Chessier's letter, for each model storm event, the peak rates entering reach 5R are not just greater, but exponentially greater under post-development conditions, violating standard 2. As Mr. Chessier has noted, Mr. Burke's own data demonstrates that the extent and duration of flooding downstream from the direct connection at the top of Meeting House Lane will be worse with the project. Now, this can be mitigated in a number of different ways. It can be mitigated by further modulating the rate of flow into Meeting House Lane, by perhaps building more storage volume into the design of the project. The project could incorporate more low impact development principles that disperse the discharge of runoff offsite. And most fundamentally, it could reduce the lot coverage in impervious surfaces in the project, thereby reducing the demand on the stormwater system. in our final written statement to the board, we will propose specific conditions to that end. And finally, it is critical for the applicant to understand that the board cannot simply ignore the site plan review and construction management planning requirements of the Federal Clean Water Act, which is triggered by this application. As we noted in our letter on May 26, Milton's adoption and implementation of its stormwater bylaw was a requirement of the MS4 permit issued by DEP and EPA. That requires all development projects to comply with the state stormwater standards. It requires, it stipulates that the town cannot allow new stormwater flows into already impaired water bodies, such as Pine Tree Brook. And this project is far from demonstrating compliance with that requirement. The applicant has provided no information as to whether the excess runoff has or will end up in the wetlands or the stream when it bypasses the surcharge drainage system in Meeting House Lane and Alfred Road. Now, finally, I'd like to just address, Mr. Chairman, some process recommendations. You mentioned earlier tonight that we need to look at waivers, and I support that. At this stage of the public hearing, it is customary for zoning boards to consider the waiver requests in light of all the testimony and other evidence that's been collected by the board on the issues that are germane to the waivers being sought. And indeed, Attorney Schomer stated in his letter to the board on January 29th that the board could request the applicant to prove that any waiver denials or even just partial denials would render the project uneconomic pursuant to the process that's outlined in the regulations. Since the evidentiary burden in appeal is on the developer, the initial burden is on the developer to prove the uneconomic effect of the board's conditions or waiver decisions, it is logical for the board to want to know before it closes the hearing whether the applicant would have a reasonable ground to appeal in the event that the board imposed restrictive conditions or denied waivers. I would suggest that we're at that point right now. The applicant has made it clear that it intends not to make any more substantive changes, as Mr. Schomer stated. They're minor tweaks at this point to the design. And therefore, it would be logical for the board to spend some time at the next session of the hearing to review each waiver request and to give the applicant an opportunity to defend these requests and to allow interested parties, including town officials, to offer their opinions. As I noted, the neighbors will produce a written statement with our recommendations on these waiver requests and on substantive conditions that would address the local concerns raised by the project. That wraps up my closing argument, so to speak. But as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, we anticipate some additional comments on changes, and we certainly would like to comment on the waivers when the time is appropriate. But at this time, I would like to ask Mr. Horsley to elaborate briefly on the issue of the site hydrology, where he is the expert and I'm simply the lawyer. And Scott can, I think, better explain the hydrological impacts that we're afraid are going to happen as a result of the project that's currently designed.
Mr. Chessie.
Yes, Mr. Horsley's here.
Oh, Mr.
Chairman.
Horsley, I'm sorry.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I will be brief because frankly, Mr. Hill did a wonderful job summarizing my comment letter, which you have in your file. But I would like to just touch and review and maybe emphasize just two points. One is, and I might ask, if I may, that these might be questions you could put to the applicant to see if they agree with this or not, because they're pretty simple and big picture questions, which might really help us going forward. The first one is that, as Mr. Hill pointed out, and as is documented in my letter, the applicant proposes to recharge almost three times, 266%, the amount of recharge on the site compared to existing conditions. That comes directly out of their engineering report. My assessment, and I would argue all of my professional peers would agree, that would result in a higher water table, not just during specific storm events, but year round. So that would be one question to see if the applicant agrees with that, because if they don't, we have a major departure in science, just a suggestion. 3 times the amount of recharge on site, groundwater levels are going to come up significantly other than the design storms. So that would be a suggested question, and to see if or not we're talking about science or something else. The second point I would make is this issue of saturated thickness, which I understand sounds like a technical matter, but I'm quite familiar with this model that they've used. It's called Hantush, the author. It is a commonly used model to predict groundwater mounding. And I think we'd all agree, and perhaps this is another question to the applicant, that this site is constrained by shallow water table, quite shallow, and therefore the mounding analysis is important. And my belief is that engineering analysis for project design should be conservative. I have to add, this might be represented by what's happened in Florida recently. We want to be careful on making sure that when we put assumptions into design of buildings, that we err on the conservative side. And this is the exact point on what Mr. Hill was talking about with saturated thickness. This Hantush model that talks about groundwater mounding, which is a requirement by the Mass DEP, like any other model or calculation, requires inputs, as he indicated. One of the most important inputs is this input called saturated thickness. That is the thickness, the amount of groundwater underneath the site. And as Mr. Hill pointed out, if it's thicker, then the groundwater mounding impacts are less. If it's thinner, then they're greater. The applicant used a value of 20 feet, which is a nice round number. When we look at their data, which I've summarized in their report, and this might be a third question to the applicant, did I correctly report their data on saturated thickness? And I would really like to hear their answer to that. I think I did. And it suggests that that value is on the order of 5 feet, about a quarter of the 20 feet. So they are using an input value to the building design, which is, in my estimation, in their reporting, about 1/4 of what they've measured. And again, I believe strongly that in engineering design of buildings, we don't want them to fall down. We don't want them to flood. We need to err on the conservative side, not the other side. And I think it's pretty clear that in this case, they're using a value which is not documented. I guess the third question I would ask is, where did the 20 feet come from? Because their test pit data shows 5 feet. So those are the 2 points I wanted to make, and those are the 3 questions that I would suggest that we get very clearly on the table, because we all want truth and transparency here. If this project goes forward and people live in the building, we want to make sure that it works. And as we all know, sometimes it doesn't work. So in this case, we need to make sure that the analyses are correct. And frankly, I don't believe they are. And I think it would be worth hearing from the applicant on those. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll stop there. And I believe we want to hear from Mr. Chesia next. But I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'm sorry. Yes.
Mr. Hill?
Yes, I'd like to ask John Chesia to elaborate on anything that he feels that I did not elaborate completely on, or if I misstated something that's technical, I'd like him to weigh in.
Okay, I think you did a good job of describing the issues. I will elaborate a little bit on the offsite impacts. I think that's something that the board had questions about throughout the process. Some data was provided. A study was done of some of the runoff conditions to both the intermittent stream and to Meeting House Lane. The problem with the analysis is that the program that was used for that doesn't really assess the flood height, or it's also not made for pipe analysis. It's right in the handbook, and in my letter, I provided a copy of the segment of the handbook that describes why this is not the appropriate program to use for that. It's good for getting runoff from certain sub areas, but it's not a pipe model in this case. So for the two systems, you have the intermittent stream. The way that should be modeled at the lower end, where there's the 42-inch pipe, is that would be modeled as a pond, and then you would know if the flood height increased. I mean, we know that the pipe's too small. We know there's too much water there. There's videos. There's videos. Is that? I mean, neighbors have provided videos of the water flowing through their yards. It doesn't all fit into the pipe in a bigger storm, and it blows through the yards. It comes out into Alfred Road. That's an existing condition. They're not required to make that better, but they should assess whether or not it's going to be worse. And the way you assess that is you model that pipe and the area around it as a pond at the lower end, and you find out what the height is and you find out what the impact is. It's a little more complicated. You need more data than probably what they have to do it, but that's the right way to do that one. Meeting House Lane. Meeting House Lane, I believe the board's been out there, everybody's been out to the site. Meeting House Lane is pretty steep when you get towards the cul-de-sac end of it. Flattens out near Alfred Road, probably the last couple of lots. And Alfred Road is basically flat with a little bit of up and down at the catch basins. It's sort of like a washboard type of situation, probably like a 1%, very slight grades. Neighbors have said, and based on the size of the pipes analyzed by Mr. Burke, that road's gonna flood in any probably decent rainfall of a couple inches or more coming down quickly. We're expected to see that area flooding. Meeting House Lane being that much higher, if you tie a pipe into that system and those pipes are now connected into a closed system within their site, you're gonna pressurize that pipe. I mean, the top of Meeting House Lane's got to be at least 20 feet higher than the Alfred Road area. So it's basically making the same situation as a water distribution system with a storage tank. The water's going to end up coming out of the catch basins and manholes. The most restrictive pipes on Alfred Road is only got a capacity of 2.5 CFS. And the flows that they've predicted coming down there are so much higher than that. Now, some of that flow may not get into the catch basins upstream, but once you put a pipe at the top of it, you've just pressurized it, water's going to come out of the catch basins. It's an unusual thing to see, but it's not that uncommon, and this is what's going to be created there. Their own data in my table shows how much flow is being proposed to put in. The smallest capacity pipes are going to be the restriction. That's the best flow you're going to be able to have. The model that they used assumes that each pipe is its own independent segment capable of taking the flow, and that's not accurate. If the flow doesn't fit in the pipe, where does the excess go? There's only one place. It either comes out or floods down, goes to Alfred Road. And with the increase they have, it's going to make it worse in Meeting House Lane for certain. They should meet the rate at the tie-in point at the top of the hill. If they meet the rate there, I think they could probably say they're not having a worse impact. If they increase the flow time and it hits the restriction down below, it still could flood more. It's a bit complicated stuff, but it's not that complicated to picture a funnel and pouring water into it, and you pour it in too fast, where's it going to go? And the bottom of that funnel is Alfred Road pipe. That's pretty much my summary.
Thank you, Mr. Chesia. I am interested in hearing from the applicant on the questions that Mr. Horsley raised and on the supplemental testimony from you, Mr. Chesia. But before we do that, Mr. Hill, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I'd like to have Mr. Black, our traffic engineer, provide his summary of where things stand with the intersection safety issues.
Mr. Black, welcome back to the Board of Appeals.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Yes, I think, Mr. Hill very nicely summarized the sort of transportation-related concerns that I've had on the project. And I think the safety issue for the driveway is really, to me, kind of the deal breaker, or the most critical of those. I don't believe that there has been any valid verification that the sight lines can be met. As Mr. Hill explained, I don't think they're measured from the correct position. They really need to be measured from the driver eye view. And it's just not clear from the graphics that those sight lines can be accomplished within controllable right-of-way, exacerbated by the potential addition of the multi-use path on that side on the project side of Blue Hill Avenue. I wanted to just add one footnote to that, and it's just maybe it's a pet peeve of mine, but I do take issue with Mr. Michaud's characterization of the sightline as being ideal. The sightline requirement is not ideal. It can never be ideal. It needs to be as long as it can. But just to explain what I mean is this: the stopping sight distance is the distance for safe distance for a driver coming along Blue Hill Avenue, spotting something that it might collide with. In this case, perhaps a driver who's made a bad judgment of entering Blue Hill Avenue from the driveway. The intersection sight distance is what is needed to help that driver make a safe decision in entering the traffic. And that's why the recommended sight distance is important. It is misleading, in my view, to call it an ideal sight distance, particularly when you consider that it's based on an 85th percentile speed measurement, and 15% of people are going faster than that 85th percentile speed. So I do, I think I just will simply say my biggest concern is really this issue of safety at the intersection on Blue Hill Avenue, given the existing conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Black. Mr. Hill,
We have no other testimony for tonight, Mr. Chairman.
thank you. I wonder if let me hear from Mr. Reardon before we ask the applicant to respond to the points made by Mr. Horsley and Mr. Chessier. Do you have a response for the board, advice for the board, comments about the testimony?
It was a lot, so let me try and break it down as quickly as I can and as thoroughly as I can. So I agree in part.
Mr. Reardon, let me just caveat this. If you'll be provided with an opportunity to have these points put into your letter. So
Yeah, that's probably a better way to address it, because it can get technical and I don't want to mislead.
Yeah, that's fine. But do you not want to speak tonight then?
No, I mean, I'll say that I in my opinion, I think the project has demonstrated that it's capable of meeting the standard, and that it is not likely to create or exacerbate downstream conditions. So I have a different opinion than Mr. Chessa. I have basis for that opinion. I do agree with him, however, that the modeling analysis that was provided in support of that is probably not the greatest tool. And my analysis, in my opinion, relies very little on that modeling analysis, but more the information within it to reach my conclusions. So I'll do my best to expand on that in the letter.
Okay, thank you.
Say about the groundwater analysis, I just want to make sure people understand that one of our comments on the stormwater model and how the infiltration was modeled in the applicant's stormwater design was to eliminate the consideration for saturated thickness by applying a more conservative assessment methodology. So I don't think the saturated thickness has a bearing on the stormwater modeling, but to Mr. Horsley's point, it absolutely does have a bearing on the mounting analysis.
Thank you. Mr. Schumer, can you respond to Mr. Horsley's questions?
Mr. Chair, I think we'll have to get back to you with specific answers on that unless Mr. Burke is prepared to answer at the moment. I feel like it's appropriate to have a few just general remarks if you would allow me to do that.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Certainly a lot to take in from Attorney Hill and his consultants. We appreciate their feedback as always. There was a lot of incorrect information, and it would take me quite a while or in quite a long list of bullet points to go through point by point to point out where certain of the comments made were incorrect or misleading or both. I think it's important, though, as a general matter, Mr. Chair, to bear in mind that the testimony that you just heard from Mr. Black and Mr. Horsley and Mr. Chesia and Mr. Hill, as much as we may appreciate it, they're not the town's consultants. They're not peer review in this matter. They're members of the public and nothing more, nothing less. I think in certain cases, and I'll be delicate in saying this because I know that there's a lot of lawyers on this call. Folks with an ESQ behind our name tend to think that we're more important than we necessarily are. And in this case, Attorney Hill, I think, likes to present himself as playing a role that's greater than his role in this proceeding actually is. With respect to the testimony of the experts, I think the most important, from my perspective, item is that the town, in this case, was given the opportunity to retain a number of peer review consultants at our expense. And in most instances, particularly with respect to the traffic, the specific stormwater design, and many of the architectural design questions, the issues under dispute were resolved between our engineers and the town's peer review consultants. And there's a reason why, Mr. Chair, that there is this process for peer review, because our engineer he's a registered professional engineer in the state of Massachusetts. Our traffic engineer is a registered traffic engineer. Our architects are registered architects in the Commonwealth. But we're not asking the board to just take our word for it. We give the opportunity, and 40B gives the board the opportunity to have our work peer reviewed by independent consultants who are not here being paid tonight to represent opponents to the project, who are not being paid to find reasons to oppose the project. And frankly, a lot of what I heard, Mr. Chair, tonight from the consultants who are retained by Attorney Hill represent comments that are more looking for problems than looking for solutions. So I think it's been a very productive peer review process, and I thank Mr. Reardon in particular, and Mr. Bomer in particular, and Mr. Dirk as well, for their very helpful and collaborative assistance in shepherding this project to the current design, which we feel will meet the stormwater standards. And there is a process for conditioning the project appropriately to ensure that it will. That being said, I would turn it over to Mr. Burke with one final comment, Mr. Chair, and I think that this is representative of the approach of Attorney Hill's consultants, and specifically it's the reference that I heard a few minutes ago to the unfortunate and tragic, frankly, occurrence in Florida, where there are a number of people who are still missing and presumed dead, and I think it's frankly inappropriate to draw a comparison between an occurrence like that in this project. I think it's inappropriate, and I think it's illustrative of the approach of the consultants tonight. I'll leave it at that and turn it over then to Mr. Burke if he has any specific responses.
Let me just say, thank you, Mr. Schomer. Before Mr. Burke speaks, nobody's represented, nobody has made a representation, and the board has never implied that it believes the experts that have been retained by the Vos Hill Neighborhood Association are anything more than that. And there's been no inference, no assumption, no representations that they are peer review consultants or playing a larger role than the role that they're playing, which is representing the neighbor's interests. So I just wanted to note that for the record. Mr. Burke.
Chairman, if I may, before Mr. Burke begins.
Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to add on your remarks, the three members of this board are all attorneys, just for the public certification. And this is a process that is centered on advocacy. And in some respects, it is an adversarial process, and it is designed to be that way. I think I can, and I hesitate to put words in the mouths of my fellow board members, but I think that the members of the board are all capable of delineating advocacy for advocacy's sake, as well as taking all of the information, technical and otherwise, and putting it into context. So I think Mr. Hill and Mr. Schumer, as well as others, I believe you understand that. I just wanted to put that on the record as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Joffer, anything to add before we go to Mr. Burke?
Nothing from me other than I I do believe I'm capable of doing what Mr. O'Brien described.
I have no doubt. Mr. Burke.
Good evening. Thank you. First and foremost, I want to, it was an excellent presentation, you guys. I mean, a lot of information, a lot of the same questions. As far as the saturated thickness goes, it wasn't, the 20 feet wasn't necessarily arbitrary. We took into account the groundwater that we found up gradient, on the up gradient side of the site, and found groundwater down on the down gradient site. And there's a significant amount of, topography differential between those. And we just kind of estimated that without refusal, the bottom of that saturated thickness, a conservative estimate would be 20 feet. Now, I mean, we're talking about too at the front where the garage is, we're talking about 15 feet of the garage being in 15 feet of groundwater. Well, there's 15 feet of saturated thickness. You could actually take the saturated thickness all the way down to Trout Brook, which is probably 60 feet below of saturated thickness. So I don't necessarily think that 20 feet is that out of the norm. I agree with Mr. Horsley that we did not drive some wells in to find out what the depth is, but I feel that the saturated thickness, especially given the calculation that it's associated with, is more than conservative and representative of what we're trying to do out there. Now, we can certainly take a look at some more conservative numbers. Each infiltration system has an overflow. It's meant to recharge the volume of water that is required in the stormwater standards. Simple as that. And let me reiterate that, explain a little further. We also provide a significant amount of detention on site because that's what's required from the stormwater standards. This site meets the stormwater standards. Now, when we look at the off-site conditions, now we use the same software to model that, which I think is appropriate. It's appropriate because this is how the site has been modeled in the past and been reviewed by peer review. So we did a 75-acre analysis of this site, of the overall site that contributes to the two outfall points to Trout Brook. One being the intermittent stream into the 42-inch pipe, and then one being a very undersized 15-inch RCP that flows into Trout Brook off of Alfred Road. Now, the analysis that we provided is a model that is informational in a sense. An experienced engineer can make an assessment. Okay, is this system on the site going to be better or worse? Now, the numbers that I show that compare apples to apples from existing to proposed show a decrease in flow as it approaches Trout Brook. That's what the calculations show. And that is a benefit for the neighborhood. I've been saying that since day one. We're doing a significant amount of detention with a surface detention basin, with an underground detention basin. Our goal, and actually it's mandated by the state standards, is to detain stormwater that you create so you don't make any sort of down gradient impacts that are harmful to down gradient abutters. That's what we've done. And what Mr. Chessie is suggesting as far as a model goes, I mean, for the 75 acres to actually model each and every single catch basin, I mean, it's just not in the books. It's not a reasonable thing to ask for a small site like this that fits into 75 acres and how it impacts the surrounding existing infrastructure. We provided that information. You can make an educated, informed decision and see how this particular site as designed impacts the down gradient infrastructure. And it's a benefit, simple as that. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Mr. Burke, can you Can you share with the board whether you believe that the data that Mr. Horsley's, can you tell us whether or not you believe that Mr. Horsley has accurately represented your data?
I'd say he's looking at the data. So we did test pits that are, 8 to 10 feet deep. I mean, that's the machine that we have out there. So you do a test pit up at elevation 230, and you go down 8 feet, and you're at 222, and you're showing groundwater at 226, and then you go down to the other side of the site, and you're at elevation, I don't know, call it 210, and you go down to elevation 200, and you're showing groundwater at 204. So you're not finding any sort of refusal whatsoever. So, and I know the area. There isn't any ledge, significant amounts of ledge in the area. It's just, fairly sandy soil that allows groundwater to flow through. Now, the difference between those two test pits elevations, that's a decent assumption of saturated thickness, in my opinion. Now, if he wants to use specific test pit data that shows, the groundwater depth exposed in a signal test pit, okay, that's very conservative, I agree. But I'd say my assumption is a little bit more accurate than his.
And did you speak to the comment about the recharging 3 times the more water? That was part of Mr. Horsley's, that was Mr. Horsley's first question?
I'd have to take a look at that, but I mean, again, the stormwater standards, the recharge is good. Especially with the saturated thickness that I expect it to be fairly deep. You're trying to get, the stormwater management standards require you to do recharge. And as far as the increase of being 300%, I would have to check the numbers and see if that's accurate. But at the same time, each of those infiltration systems has an overflow. It's going to reach a certain elevation and start running into the detention basin. Now, whatever's left below that is going to recharge. So there is a finite amount of volume of water that's going to recharge. All right, and it's based on 0.35 inches for every impervious square foot that we show on the site. That's how we comply. We comply with the stormwater standards, whether it's 300% or or exactly the same. I couldn't tell you right now. I'd have to check the data. But again, with we did the groundwater mounting, which I feel is representative of the site, and which shows the groundwater mount. It has no impact with the infiltration structure in the detention areas. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. But all I'm saying is that what Mr. Horsley is saying is conservative and, in my opinion, inaccurate.
Fair enough. Anything further, Mr. Burke?
I'm all set. If you guys have any questions, I'm here.
I don't. I'll ask the members in a second if they do. Mr. Reardon, I'm going to confess to really not understanding the saturated thickness point that's being made. That's beyond my, it's not a term I'm familiar with. I haven't come across this in my other life. So the reason I want to say that, confess to everybody, is I think it would be helpful if in your report you addressed Mr. Horsley's points, if you, particularly in light of what Mr. Burke just said. I'm interested in the answers to those questions, and I would urge you to make it as plain language as you can. I think the concepts that we're working with are fairly straightforward. That is, make sure that the stormwater design works, is conservative, will be adequately maintained, and there will be security to have that happen, and will be not damaging to adjacent properties or exacerbating the adjacent property conditions in adjacent properties, nor exacerbating the condition with the offsite infrastructure. That seems to me to be a pretty standard set of requirements. I'm also going to confess to being concerned about the image of the garage being underwater, and making sure that I know that's just an image, and I understand that there's more design to be done, but I do think we have to make certain that we're accommodating that fact, making reasonable assumptions about what that really means, and opining, or at least giving the board some instructions on what that might mean for the long-term health of the garage and the impact that it might have on the groundwater on the property. Those are the issues that, are most striking to me, just based on what we've heard tonight. But let me ask the members of the board if they've got anything that they would like to address to any of the people with whom we've conversed tonight.
Mr. Chair, if I could.
Mr. Reardon, yes.
Just before you go, I think I can help explain the saturated thickness if you care to, in about 30 seconds.
Fine.
It might. So the whole premise of evaluating the groundwater table is you want to make sure that there's significant changes don't impact your assumptions for your system performance. The saturated thickness refers to the zone underneath the ground that the groundwater flows through. And the thicker that zone is, the smaller the new water has an impact on it. So if it's a thin zone, the additional water will have a bigger impact than if it's a very, very thick zone. I don't think it's unreasonable at all.
That's on a relative basis.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
yes.
so 1 feet of impact on 10 feet of saturated thickness is only 10%. 1 feet of impact on 2 feet of saturated thickness is 50%.
Well, and the thicker the saturated zone, the smaller the net change. So
Understood, yeah.
a thinner zone, then your actual net change is going to be bigger. So it's going to be a more pronounced change as well as being relatively more significant. So to your point, but I do think, based on my experience, and again, I'm just going on the same information everybody else has, is that I would expect the 20 foot to be a reasonable estimate. I think Mr. Horsley's correct in saying all we can prove is that it's 5 feet because that's the depth that we went to. So typically what would happen in that situation is you use the 5 feet and say, well, from what we know, it still works, and move on. I would imagine that if Jim tested it with a 5 foot saturated thickness, we probably wouldn't see that big a difference in the results. And then the other thing I keep in mind too is, to allay some concerns, is the recharge only happens when it rains or when it precipitates. So this is not a flow that is constantly recurring. So usually we pay a lot of attention with mounding analysis as we're talking about septic systems or things like that have daily recurring flows that change patterns every day. I tend to admittedly discount some of the stormwater evaluation of groundwater mounding because it's such a periodic occurrence. It's a very inexact science, and it's got very little weight in the stormwater standards. So it's kind of an afterthought in most applications. So I don't want to minimize it, but I'm being as honest as I can. The groundwater mounding on stormwater systems is not usually a fulcrum point for very many decisions. And to Jim's point, what he's doing is what's required by the stormwater standards. And it's kind of the hardest thing to do, is to get water back in the ground and provide enough storage for it.
Okay, thank you. Board members? Ms.
Thank you,
Johnson.
Mr. Chair. I have just two quick comments and then a request for Mr. Reardon. But my comments are directed towards Mr. Schomer's. First, I disagree that lawyers in general or Mr. Hill in specific are self-important. And I just actually, we invited Mr. Hill to present, and I thank him for what I thought, with the appropriate skepticism as he is an advocate. I still thought it helpful that he referenced some of our own peer reviewers, experts over time. So thank you for Mr. Hill for the background research. There have been a lot of hearings, and we, of course, as the board, will double check your references. It was helpful to have that. And I found your presentation to be very professional. My second comment is that I do agree with Mr. Schomer that the reference to Florida was a little alarmist and potentially disrespectful. It's just my 2 cents. Mr. Reardon, Mr. Schomer also said, well, there are conditions you can put in place to ensure that a system like this will work. And, I heard what seemed to me to be reasonable characterizations that any assessment here is going to involve some sort of speculation, right? The system's not built, and we don't have the 2-year storm to test it live. So my request to you is that when you do, after further consideration, and when you do write this up, if you can specifically advise the board with respect to any conditions that will take out as much speculation as possible, that would be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jaffa. Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, with your permission, I'd like to go back to one of the earlier presentations that didn't have to do with drainage, specifically Mr. Black. And I would like to ask Mr. Black a comment concerning some of the statements that he made.
Please.
Thank you. Mr. Black, good evening, and thank you once again for joining us. Appreciate you being here. During the course of your presentation, you made some comments concerning sight lines and the way that the driveways are configured, suggesting that there are some particular safety issues. If I recall correctly, Attorney Hill spent a considerable amount of time earlier in this session, hearing process, dealing with much the same issue, and ultimately resulted in the applicant having some additional measurements taken. Help me understand, were those measurements inadequate, incorrect, or is, and in addition to that, is the concern that you make, that you've articulated regarding the driveway, is it solvable? Are we talking about a construction issue, a design issue that can be fixed?
So the strict answer to that is that the additional information as presented does not demonstrate that the sight lines can be accomplished. Primarily because the measurement appears to be taken at a position in front of the stop line rather than a position behind the stop line. The intersection sight distance is critical for allowing the driver exiting the street or the driveway to make a good judgment on oncoming traffic. And it has a recommended value, which, as I said, is not, it's not an ideal value. I think more is better, given that, some traffic is moving faster than the 85th percentile speed. The other piece, which to me is not clear from the information as presented, is whether if that sight line was measured correctly from behind the stop line at the driver's point of view, whether the sight line could be actually accomplished within land under the control of the proponent. In other words, on the proponent's site. So that I can't give a very black and white answer, because it's not drawn that way. So it's impossible to tell from the information as presented. I'm not just relying on drawings and standards and such. I'm also relying on my own experience standing at the driveways and pretending that I am a driver at coming out of the driveway. And I'm just personally not convinced that the sight lines can be met. So I think that's why we asked for the measurement, or we recommended that the measurements be made. And it just appears to me that if they were measured in the field and the profile of Blue Hill Avenue is taken into account, they have not been presented in a way that demonstrates they can be accomplished. Which in turn, and I think you were sort of saying, is that you were, I think, asking whether that was a significant safety concern, or perhaps you were asking that. But I do. I mean, I think that intersection safety on a road like Blue Hill Avenue is extremely important for a project that is so car dependent. And if there is any delay in exiting the driveway on a project like this, drivers are tempted to accept shorter gaps in the traffic and take risks. So I do maintain that it's a very important safety concern.
Thank you, Mr. Black. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Anything further, Mr. Schomer?
Just one follow-up comment, Mr. Chair, and this is specifically on the issue of traffic. Unfortunately, we don't have our engineer here tonight. You know, Mr. Black, we appreciate his comments, and he in his response to Mr. O'Brien a few minutes ago, he made some comments to the effect of he's not sure if it meets the standards. I think it's important to be clear that our professional traffic engineer who's licensed in Massachusetts is sure that it meets the standards, and the town's professional engineer who is licensed in Massachusetts is sure that it meets the standards. They agree. I don't want to misstate Mr. Black's professional credentials, but my understanding is that he's more of a traffic planner and is not a registered traffic engineer in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So in this case, with respect to Mr. Black, I would suggest that the board rely more on their own peer review expert and the testimony of our professional engineer. That's all I would say about that.
So Chairman, may I respond to that?
Okay, I was going to, but go ahead.
Okay. Mr. Black can speak for himself, but he's a traffic engineer. He's not currently licensed in Massachusetts, but he has the pedigree of a traffic engineer, and he worked for decades at VHB. I don't think anyone's questioning his background or experience. And what he meant by saying he wasn't sure is because the plans that were presented don't confirm that the sight lines, that the sight distances are met. It's not that Mr. Black doesn't know. His point is that Mr. Michaud's presentation was not clear enough. So the issue is not Mr. Michaud is sure and Mr. Black isn't. The question is whether the evidence is sufficient to prove that the sight distances have been met.
Mr. Schomer?
I would say only in response, Mr. Chair. I think the deciding point on this should be Mr. Dirk's opinion on this, and he was satisfied with the analysis.
Yeah, the point's been made. I just have to respond to the fact that I think I speak for the board. It's not appropriate to disparage the experts. You know, I've known Mr. Black for 25 years. I can speak to his professionalism. He's worked on many projects going back most of my own personal career. So fair point about his role here in representing the neighbors versus the town review, but I'm not going to, I need to need to speak to Mr. Black's background and professionalism. And with respect to the applicants and Mr. Hill's presentation, I have to say I want to thank him and his team for the time they've put in, not just in this hearing, but the 19 previous hearings that date back to 6 months. For some reason, tonight has got a little bit of an edge to it with respect to, you know, a little bit beyond, my opinion, a little bit beyond what is, you know, come to be, I think, a fairly courteous hearing, despite we've got some contentious issues. So let me, on behalf of the Board of Appeals of the town of Milton, Mr. Hill, thank you for your presentation and your professionalism, and let you know how at least we think about and appreciate the time you've put in and your consultants have put in on behalf of the neighbors who I think are expressing their view of the local concerns about which we've been asked to consider. So let me say, so I think we've gotten through the substance of the hearing for tonight and just build a little bit of a roadmap for where we're headed. I don't see Mr. Zawinski here, but I would like to try to rely on the potential to hear from the town officials next week. If we're not able to do that, then I think we're going to have to hear from the applicant on the waivers.
Mr. Chair, I hate to interrupt, but it does look like Mr. Zawinski's in the audience with his hand up.
He's an attendee.
Okay, Tim,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was lurking in the back, as it were. Yes, I did have my hand raised from the very beginning of your introductory remarks. Chase Berkeley is actually on vacation this week, so I haven't been able to confirm with him. But I have reminded him that the board would like to hear from him, and that next Wednesday's hearing would probably be an appropriate time to do that. So it is, he is out of town, and it is a long holiday weekend, so I won't be able to know for sure until Tuesday. Mr. Berkeley, along with all of my colleagues among the department heads in town of Milton, have been very accommodating and gracious in their scheduling. So I think if he's available on Wednesday, he'll be here on Wednesday.
that's great. I agree with that. Thank you.
Additionally, I think the planning board is working on arranging for at least one of their members to be at next week's hearing to offer some commentary. Mr. Chair, I had emailed you to the effect of, the planning board wanted to offer some final comments, and you agreed that that was a good idea. So I can confirm this tomorrow, but my instinct, based on my conversations with them, has been that they anticipate coming in next week.
Right. Okay, let's plan on that. And then if time permits, Mr. Schomer, we'll hear from you on the waivers. I will, we may return to some issues that Mr. Bomer raised. I've got a series of questions here that we'll get to within the time. But I think if we can focus on those two activities, I think that will be time well spent. Is there any other business for the board tonight? Mr.
Mr.
O'Brien.
Horsley has his hand up.
Mr. O'Brien.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, I believe that Mr. Reardon will be putting together some additional information, hopefully within the week. I'll be very interested in seeing that as well. And if it is indeed sent to the board in time, if we could carve out a few minutes for Mr. Reardon to talk about that at the next hearing as well, it'd be appreciated.
I think he said it would be at least a week, so I was thinking that he might be the following week.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry.
I would appreciate that.
Yeah, I think I think that's where we're going to end up. Feels that way. Mr. Horsley.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief. Just a suggestion. I believe I heard from both Mr. Burke and Mr. Reardon about conservative analysis, meaning make sure the engineering analysis and the groundwater mounding takes into account the most conservative values. I believe, and I don't want to speak for him, he can correct me, Mr. Reardon suggested that perhaps even a 5-foot saturated thickness would not make much difference. I would just suggest that you ask the applicant to run that analysis, because I have. And I think that some people might be surprised with the results. So per Mr. Reardon's suggestion about a 5-foot value, which is consistent with their test pit information, I think it would be interesting to the board to see those results. And that would be my recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Mr. McGrath.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
So, Mr. Mullen, just quickly, you had asked for a homework assignment from Mr. Schumer 2 meetings ago.
Yes.
And Giselle specifically brought up snow. You specifically asked about trash and how that would work. And now we're into the management plan. But Mr. Schumer specifically said there would be 90 trash barrels in a 300 square foot spot. So that's the second meeting that we've asked about their homework assignment. And it just seems to be getting pushed off. And no one talks about the snow, like Giselle specifically asked, the little things that get forgotten. So now we're going to talk about expanding the playground. So will that push into the snow area that they've designated? They're very simple questions that they just seem to be getting lost in the Zoom calls. And thank you very much. Mr. Burke, you should walk the intermittent stream from 176 Robin Street to 152 Robin Street tomorrow morning. I'll be there around 7, putting all the rocks back from the massive flow of water that is 100% over capacity. I was going to take pictures today, but with the lightning, I didn't really feel like walking the stream. Thank you, and I'll have a very nice 4th of July.
Thank you, Mr. McGrath. Mr. Schumer, Mr. McGrath does remind us that that was one of your homework assignments. If you could, I will expect that, I think you may have listed the trash in your list of things about which you'll have a response to, but I don't think we heard the snow. And we are interested in the snow. And to the main point that Ms. Joffer made, I think in her introductory comments following the redesign is, let's not forget about the smaller issues, which do actually go to quality of life concerns. So.
If I may, Mr. Chair, just
Please.
on the issue of the trash management plan, and to Mr. McGrath's point through you, we absolutely haven't forgotten about it. I did mention it briefly at the end of the last hearing.
Yep.
We have a plan. I'm happy to put it up on the screen sharing and show the board this preliminarily. The only reason why I haven't filed it already is because we wanted everything to come in one final plan submission, so that things weren't coming in piecemeal and creating confusion about what was the latest and whether what we're submitting is part of the proposal. But I'd be happy to show it to you if you'd like to see it now.
What I think would be good is next week we're going to hear from Mr. Berkeley from the planning board, and we will give you time to present maybe a synopsis of the submittal to which you referred. Now, what I was inferring from that is we will be getting a submittal between now and next Wednesday, which will be publicly available and people can look at. I think it would be helpful if you took some time to walk us through that, and you can therefore then go on the record with some of these important issues that have come up a few times, consistent with what Mr. McGrath has said.
Understood, Mr. Chair. I think I'm not certain that all of the materials will be ready for submission before next week's hearing, but I'll do my best to get it done.
That's okay. We're going to have a couple more hearings, and we're not going to run out of time, because we're going to have to figure out a hearing schedule that accommodates the conclusion of this hearing in an orderly fashion, and we'll address that between now and the last currently scheduled hearing. But I don't think we're going to be able to fit all of the things that we need to do within the remaining time. At least that's what it looks like to me. But we committed to you that we wouldn't, that we would do our best with the remaining time, and I'm hoping that we're adhering to that commitment. So, any other business? Any comment on that, Mr. Schumer?
No further comment, Mr.
Okay.
Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Hill?
Sorry, nothing for me. Thanks.
Is that actually the view from 6 Beacon? Is that what we're looking at? I can see looking down Bowden Street.
It is. It's my office.
Yeah. Any further business?
There are 2 attendees still
Yes.
that would like, that have their hands up.
Yeah.
Okay. Chris?
Mr. Parados?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm at 152 Robin Street.
Yes.
You know, you guys all walk the site
Yeah.
downstream from Mike. And, you know, like I said previously, we own just about 700 feet of that waterway that we're going to be introducing water to or talking about.
Yes.
So I have a question. It's probably for Mr. Reardon or Mr. Burke. It's is there a concern with contaminants coming off this, you know, the new paved surfaces and all the vehicles and oil, gas coming on and getting deposited somewhere on that stretch of intermittent stream? Because that'd be pretty concerning.
Thank you, Mr. Prados. We'll ask Mr. Reardon to address that in his written report. Mr. Reardon, okay?
Okay.
I can answer the question now too.
Yep.
Mr.
Yeah,
Chair.
okay.
Sorry. There are explicit standards for maintaining water quality in their treatment system. So they meet those standards, and Mr. Parados can be reasonably certain that the water coming off their site will meet the applicable standards.
Onto a private stream, the private portion of the stream that we
Yes.
maintain and pay
Okay,
taxes
Mr.
on.
McGrath, you've
Have a
sat
good
through
weekend. I'm sorry.
You know the rules.
I-
Okay, you can be recognized and you can be heard, okay?
I-
We're not gonna get this into a back and forth. If you have a
I'm gonna
question,
go watch the Tampa Bay Montreal game. Have a good night.
if you want to be recognized, I'll recognize you. I think I've shown that I have an ability to do that. I don't want people talking over other people, and I want to control this hearing. Mr. McGrath, you have a comment?
No, sir. Thank you and have a happy 4th of July.
Yeah, Mr. Parados?
Yeah, just a second question. It's really quick. It's just, I think we had heard that conservation was gonna get involved in looking at the way it's gonna, since now it comes into that 100-foot buffer. Has that process started, or is that gonna, when does that happen? How does it relate to this Board of?
At the last hearing, we had the Milton Conservation Commission testify. That process has not started, but they will be involved.
Okay, so I'll just stay tuned for that. I guess.
We're certain that anything that the board does will be respectful and will recognize the role of the Milton Conservation Commission with respect to the compliance with the Clean Water Act.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Anybody else?
Yes, Paul Gallagher.
Mr. Gallagher?
Good evening, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I just like to address, obviously, a little something that I think has been forgotten, and I think Attorney Shoma, when he said his experts have addressed all the issues, I would disagree. So I'm going to get into the sewer issue. We know there is a sewer issue. At the walkthrough, if I could just get into a little history, Mr. Burke tried to tell the board and the neighbors that a sewer connection from their project to the meeting house sewer main could be handled without issue. Stated the system would be able to only have to handle their development, Delphi Academy, and approximately 10 houses on meeting house. What he didn't mention, or God forbid know, was Barbara Lane, Alfred Road, dumped into the same manhole, which is located at the base of my driveway on Meeting House. Without the development, there's too much going on in this manhole. It's been a poor design for many years, and additional sewerage is only going to exacerbate the situation. Additionally, the board, Mr. Tim Posey, Mr. Schomer, Mr. Burke, were present when Mr. Berkeley said at that walkthrough that there is a problem in that manhole. And if I may just remind everybody, he stated the problem was before the MWRA connection. They didn't know exactly what the problem was, but they were working to find it out. So it was shortly after this, Mr. Burke told my wife and I, we're going to fix your problem. We're going to fix your sewer problem. And since then, crickets. I've heard nothing. That was his recommendation, but have heard nothing. I've heard Mr. Burke tell the board he should try to get in touch with me. Never has. And I'm easy to get in touch with. Mr. Berkeley did what the board asked him to. Mr. Chesia did on his own. I'm not hard to find. Everybody has my address. Mr. Berkeley even found my cell phone number. I've heard Mr. Burke tell the board he doesn't know if my sewer connection goes to Alfred Road or Meeting House. It's safe to say everyone involved in this hearing knows my sewer goes to that manhole on Meeting House. You're not paying attention if you don't know. We were standing on that manhole at the walkthrough with Mr. Berkeley. Mr. Burke has told the board he couldn't find a diagram on my sewer connection, but in the same breath told the board my sewer pipe does a U-turn. First off, a diagram was filed with the town in 2018 when it was redone. Secondly, there are no U-turns in my sewer. And if you don't have access to a diagram, how do you tell the board there is a U-turn? This is the chair said a couple of weeks ago, it's the little things that get gotten. And I feel like this has gotten forgotten, not by the board, but I know the board is well aware of this issue, but I think by the experts, particularly Mr. Burke, but this problem is real. Mr. Berkeley told everybody this problem is real. And it affects me. I had a problem as recently, despite having a new sewer line, I had a problem as recently as November of 2020. So what I would ask is that somehow this gets addressed. And if it's just going to go by the wayside, if the board can put as many conditions as legally possible to make sure when myself or somebody else in the neighborhood is victimized by sewage or water, that we have some sort of recourse. And I just don't want that to be forgotten. I know the board hasn't, but I just wanted to get that out there since this is probably one of my last times to speak. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Zawinski, if you can make sure that Mr. Berkeley's got the most recent offsite infrastructure report handy for himself, we'll be expecting him to speak to the issue about which Mr. Gallagher spoke just now next week.
Absolutely.
Okay. And I do think Mr. Gallagher accurately set forth at least my memory of that walk down, both at the top of the hill and at the bottom of the hill when we were right in front of that manhole. Mr. Burke.
Just to confirm a couple of things. I didn't say I'd fix it. I said I'd identify it. And we've been in touch with Weston and Sampson, the town of Milton sewer consultants with regards to this issue. And I've talked to Mr. Berkeley about it, and we're working towards a resolution. Thank you.
Mr. Hill.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Gallagher reminded me that Weston and Sampson did actually submit an email for the record. Kate Parati, the senior project manager, recommended that before any flows from the project be entered into the sewer system, that a metering study / hydraulic capacity analysis be conducted for this stretch of the system. So I think that's a good question for Mr. Berkeley as to whether he would recommend that be done now before the hearing is closed, or if that's something that can be done post-permit.
Yeah. Tim, if you could just make a note on that. I assume Weston and Sampson is the town's consultant?
Yes, yes.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
We actually submitted that email for the record.
Okay, so from DeSell and Burke, not from Weston and Sampson.
It was submitted to me from Chase Berkeley, and then I forwarded it to Mr. Schomer, who forwarded it to the town.
Okay, all right. Well, let's get to this issue. It's come up half a dozen times or so. So I mean, I think people understand the issue. Thank Mr. Gallagher for reminding us of it. Further business for the board.
We have one more attendee, Eileen Sullivan Fitzgerald.
Yes, Ms. Fitzgerald. Ms. Fitzgerald.
No, she's been asked to unmute, so. Okay, while we are waiting for her, perhaps Stuart Harris has his hand up, and those are the only two.
Okay, I just want to remind people, I mean, the whole hearing was from the neighbors. So I'm assuming that Mr. Hill is speaking for the people who was, I don't know if these people are a member of the client group, but I didn't expect actually there would be Q&A in light of the fact that the entire hearing was dedicated to neighborhood comments. So, but I'm sorry, Bev, who's got the question?
Stuart Harris.
Mr. Harris.
Trying to unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Mullen and company, I appreciate your patience. So I'm an emergency physician at Mass General Hospital. I live immediately downstream at the end of the big pipe on Robbins Street at 64 Robbins. It's good to see Jim Burke and other friends from past engagements. I just wanted to register my concern. So no small part of my research and my daily clinical practice is the interaction of climate change and human health. And as we're introducing a massive density development that's well off of any well-established public transportation infrastructure, it really makes me wonder how in the very near future, we're going to look back on this and wonder how in the world was this considered to be a thoughtful idea. If we were down on the T, I would feel very differently. But just as far as a public policy matter, this really, it strains credulity to think we're going to be taking, 3 to 4 to 5 car spots and multiplying that by 50 in the face of imminent and occurring climate change and the very real health impacts it's having. They're showing up in the MGH-ED right now, and it's only going to get worse. It just makes me wonder about the vision that we're moving forward with here. Much more selfishly, I think a couple of people have already today mentioned the thunderstorm. The lot behind me and next to me routinely floods. It's a wetlands. And as we move from a system that has some natural resilience to a lot of hard surfaces that are then going to be dumped into this drainage, I'm going to be directly at the end of that cannon. And for us to move forward as a community using historic data give me reason to be concerned. But obviously, we're turning up the volume. What's happening in Portland, Oregon, and in Seattle now, across the nation, we're having a marked increase in extreme events, and they're not going to be extreme at all in the future. This will be the new normal. And for us to think that we're moving forward in a way that's just rational, that's thoughtful, that's in any way prudent, it just strains credulity. And I would ask everybody involved in this to not be lulled into a sense of thinking that we can look back at past climate events as a predictor of what is going to be in our very near future, or even maybe occurring right now tonight. So that's the caution and request I would send to this august group, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Anybody else, Bev? Ms. Was it Ms.
Yes, I was just sending you a note. We have Eileen Fitzgerald.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hey, I'm not going to rehash something new, something old. This is just something that's sort of a corollary to things that have been raised in the past, but it has to do with the most recent runoff plan from the developer. My understanding is that there's going to be a substantial volume of runoff from the project directly into the Meeting House Lane storm sewer system and the stream that flows behind Meeting House Lane that ultimately flows into Trout Brook. My new point is that where I live on Alfred Road, and many of my neighbors who are on Alfred Road, whose backyards the Trout Brook flows through. And if we're going to have additional runoff going through Trout Brook, and we have already experienced flooding in our yards, are we going to experience a double whammy, so to speak? I've never testified in the past about the flooding in my backyard. Since I've been here since about 2006, on perhaps 6 occasions, I've witnessed 3 to 4 inches of flooding in a substantial portion of my backyard. And I'm not as close to Trout Brook as other properties on Alfred Road. So if I understand the applicant's proposal correctly, those on Alfred Road that abut Trout Brook face a double whammy, so to speak. We could have, if there's any problems with their methodologies or their estimates, and we experience flooding from Alfred Road on the street, if the street itself floods, and we also have flooding from Trout Brook, how are our particular properties being impacted? Are we at increased risk of flooding because of the potential from extra water from both directions?
Yeah.
That's my question, and I appreciate your time. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you, Ms. Fitzgerald. We'll hear from Mr. Berkeley on the point, and I believe that Mr. Reardon in his report will address that issue as well.
Thank you
Any-
kindly.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
We do have one more, Joanne Fu.
Ms. Fu?
Yes, we live in 56 Meeting House Lane, so I just have a question. At the last two meetings, we talked about, connecting, the sewage to the Meeting House Lane and the easement. So is that not a concern anymore, the easement? Do we have an easement?
That remains a concern. The applicant's not documented the presence of an easement, indicated that they will either seek a formal easement from you or seek to go to court to establish an easement adversely by prescription through declaratory judgment. He's gone on the record on that. There's a letter in the file, but no, the easement has not been documented.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Further questions?
There are no more.
Okay, thank you, Bev. Okay, so any other comments from the members?
We
Nothing
have no
from me, Mr.
panelists
Chairman.
with their hands up.
What's that, Bev?
Oh, I'm sorry. We have no panelists with their hands up.
Yeah, no, I'm asking the members if they've got a comment.
That's
Nothing for me, Mr. Chair.
Frank?
Nothing for me either.
Okay, all right. So we'll conclude the business of the board tonight, and we'll recess this hearing till next Wednesday, at which time we'll hear from the planning board, from Mr. Berkeley, and from the applicant on the various pieces of homework. The applicants indicated that they may have a submittal between now and next Wednesday, recognizing it's a holiday weekend. That may not happen. I understand that. But I am interested in hearing from the applicant on that. I think we also should take some time to schedule the next couple of hearings as we wind this down, and reserve some time for the board to have questions. But there being no further business before the board tonight, we'll stand in recess till next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Thank you very much.
Happy 4th, everyone. Take care.
Goodbye now.